improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Carry On Podcast SITREP edition for a brand new year, the first week of 2026, and good riddance to 2025. I don't know how it was for you, but for me, it was not my favorite year on this planet, so I am looking forward to a fresh fright start. Yeah, that's exactly how that goes. Already off to a good one. Hey, I am having a lovely dram of Woodford Reserve this evening to share with everyone. So pick your favorite beverage and let's settle in for some once around the world. There has been a tremendous events that have taken place over the last 30 days. I am not going to get into each and every one of them, but just a couple of key highlights. We did have a strike against ISIS in Somalia that was pretty effective. That continues to be a hotbed of activity for that particular terrorist node. And the United States, despite the national security strategy and a shifting priority globally for the Department of War, it remains front and center in the short and mid-range target list for the United States. We also conducted kinetic strikes in cooperation with the Nigerian government against some of the terrorist organizations in that country. And if you remember back in my earlier discussion about some of the courses of action involving those cells in Nigeria, one of the COAs was that the U.S. cooperates hand in hand with the Nigerian government, sharing intelligence and sharing assets to target and strike some of these terrorist cells. And it looks like that's the COA that they had chosen. So, yeah, man, good on them. Doing it unilaterally, especially in a sovereign country, is always a sticky wicket, and it has a lot of ripple effects. So, yeah. Speaking of ripples, we've continued to target drug boats in the Caribbean. A couple more strikes, a couple more people dead. And hey, this time they let the survivors swim for it. So we don't have to listen to everybody whine about that one for the next couple of weeks. Bravo. And a few other little bits and bobs. Ukraine and Russia continue to hate one another. No surprise there. I will say that I think it's surprising that we continue to give Russia any latitude at all when it comes to negotiations. This is classic Soviet Union, old Cold War Russia stall tactics. I like the fact that they are saying, well, we're going to have a meeting to discuss what color the paper needs to be on the invitations that put forth the next peace discussions, and it's not going to end. They launched a huge swarm of drones into the Ukraine capital, targeting infrastructure, trying to demoralize and break the back of the Ukrainian people's will to fight. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. So I love the fact that they negotiate, and while the negotiations are ongoing, continue to attack. Now, to be fair, it's not as if a ceasefire was called, but bro, why do you continue to give the Russian government any credibility whatsoever? It's a waste of time. It's a waste of time having them over to Mar-a-Lago. It's a waste of time talking to their negotiation teams, because this isn't going to bear any fruit. But hey, that's fine. You do you, boo. What else has taken place in the world? I think that's probably a good place to pause for the moment. As I said, there's a lot of things that can be discussed if we wanted to go global, whether it's Africa, Middle East, we could talk about Gaza. But the thing that has piqued my interest for Thursday, January 1st, 2026, are two big events that I think are going to continue to shape the world's landscape for the next 5 to 10 years. First and foremost is Iran. I, at this point, would assume that most of you have been watching the news, reading it, listening to it, or watching it, and have learned that Iran is in the midst of yet another protest. Now, this is one of the first protests that they have engaged in since, I think the last one was 2022. So they've had a few before that, and before that, and before that. But what's unique about this protest is who is conducting the protest and some of the rhetoric that is coming out of it. So as far as the who, There was a group of shopkeepers in the capital city of Tehran who, in protest of the extraordinarily high inflation rates, began shuttering their shops, basically closed for business. The phone retailers immediately followed suit, and the two groups, shopkeepers and mobile phone retailers, which, it represents a pretty good slice of that middle class money, they shuttered their shops in protest, and it spread like wildfire. And then it moved outside of Tehran into the surrounding cities, into the countryside. It almost encompasses the entirety of Iran at this point. That spurs, as it always does, college and university students in Iran to join the protest. Okay, so far so good. Why is this any different? Again, it's the shopkeepers that are doing it. Ordinarily, it's students and it's low-income poor. Iran really doesn't have a middle class. I think the closest thing to a middle class is these merchants, these retailers. They're the ones that are earning money consistently. So for them to turn to the government and say, we are protesting what is taking place economically, it speaks volumes, because they are willing to cut their nose off to spite their face. It is very interesting to see. So the students and the university, I'm not surprised at that. They will pick up the flag of any protest, no matter what it is. They're pretty quick. So why is the shopkeepers, or why are the shopkeepers so concerned? Well, inflation, it is rampant. Now, there has been a lot of limitations on the Iranian economy. The United States and a lot of the world has sanctioned Iran, sanctioned their oil exports, sanctioned money that comes in, sanctioned money that comes out. And it's definitely taking a toll. Right now, the rial is 42,000 rial to the US dollar. That's a lot, and it's climbing. In fact, that number is a bit of a spike compared to the last 30 days. So what the shopkeepers are trying to signal to the government is, you have to give us some relief. Enough is enough. We're all globally feeling a lot of this inflation. We are all feeling the crunch, increased prices. Everybody became hypersensitized during the COVID to the supply chain fragility. And a lot of countries and a lot of places, they're not still in the throes of that COVID era supply chain crunch, but some places have really never recovered in its entirety, especially when we're talking about a country like Iran, who still to this day has just a boatload of sanctions against them. And I'm sorry to say, it's kind of well-deserved. You overthrew the legitimate government back in the 70s, instituted a theocracy, and what did you expect that you were going to get? You got exactly what you asked for. So if you want something different, this is your opportunity. But we've seen this before. I am not holding my breath. More on the protests. Why is this also unique? Like I said, the rhetoric. A lot of the college students or the university students, depending on what country you're in, we call them college students. Outside the United States, everyone is university, whatever. In the city of Fasa, they attempted to force entry into the governor's office. They broke a lot of glass, they damaged the facade, and that in and of itself is not a huge anomaly. Protests are, even here in America, prone to a tremendous amount of structural damage. For somebody who was around in San Diego when the Los Angeles riots were taking place and got to watch them live on TV, it was hilarious how much damage people were doing. And I say hilarious just in the sense of sheer destruction. Not that I want anyone's livelihood to be destroyed, at least not here in America. No, what was unique were the students were shouting death to Khomeini and death to the dictator. Now that's different, because prior there has been nothing like that It was, we want this liberty, we want this freedom. We're protesting against a particular individual who was, they feel, wrongly arrested and persecuted, or the hijabs that were for a while quite trendy to discard and throw on the ground. Then women were getting arrested and sometimes disappearing and never being heard from again. Now, this is not those type of protests. They are actively and vocally advocating for death to Khomeini. And I have to say, the government of Iran at this point is fairly restrained in its response. This is the other thing that is extraordinarily curious. Usually when you see protests like this that don't include language like death to Khomeini, they come in there with a sledgehammer, literally and figuratively, and quell the protests in pretty short order. No matter how violent they are, there's always either police or sometimes military forces that are sent in to squash it. And that hasn't happened in the same level that we've seen in previous protests. In this protest, the government is basically shutting the country down under the guise of saving energy and weather conditions are too bad to have the country online. So they're shutting it down under these, a false frame. Cold weather and energy constraints. Yeah, a fine time. Right at the same time that there's massive protests in the country. So because security forces are not completely out of the picture, they're still there. They're focused on some key areas where protesters are most likely to congregate and or most likely to fan the flames of a protest. And there has been some fatalities. This has been corroborated with several reputable sources. This is multiple source reporting that there has been fatalities. Now, the exact number, that is unknown. The exact nature of the fatalities, that is also unknown. It would be a safe assumption to say that it was probably due to a gunshot to the head, but I wasn't there and I am speculating. Let's see, some of the other things. Oh, so they fired the current central banking leader, and they replaced him with the last guy, which is really nice because the last guy was impeached for fraud. And so they brought him back in the hopes that economic stability would return to the country, inflation would be curbed. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. So there has been injuries, there has been fatalities, both of which have been reported by reputable mainstream sources. And I don't think that this is going to be the last that we're going to see. So all of this is being driven, as I said, by rampant inflation. The real has hit an extreme low on the global market. Not that a lot of people are trading in the Iranian stock market, but they still have to pay for things. They still have to buy goods and services, and they still have to be able to export and import, even restricted though it may be. Inflation is at, we're talking about the 40% range. It's pretty high inflation. Even for those of us that did not major in economics, 40% inflation that's pretty ruthless. So it was the merchants first, and then the students, and then after all of the commerce stopped, that's when the regime felt the effects and really started to decide, how are we going to respond to these protests? What is our official government position on the macro, and on the micro? Where are we going to deploy troops, police? How are we going to crack down on this? And they're walking a very fine line. If you make a martyr out of any of the protesters, you're just going to incite more protest. They know this. They have learned a lot from the last 10 to 15 years of seeing these every couple of years prop up. So they have a response. The shutdown does a couple of things for them. Shutting the country down, closing universities, moving classes to online, forcing people to stay home with curfews. And if there's no shops open, there shouldn't be anybody on the street. And that helps passively disperse the population and doesn't allow them to mingle out in the local open areas where they may decide to impulsively get swept up into some of these protests. What else? Limited economic signaling. So if You replace the current central banking chief, you put in a new guy, you promise that things are get better. The hope is that it will pacify the protesters, or at least bring the merchants and the shopkeepers back to their places of business and relieve some of the pressure that's taking place. It's a slow roll. Doesn't cost the government anything by firing the current guy and replacing him with the last guy. And it's going to work, at least in the short term. Now, here's another twist, is the government's response being so low key. As I said, what they're basically saying is, we get it. The government publicly on state-run media said, you're right. The economy is in a pretty bad way. You are more than welcome to feel bad about it, and you are more than welcome to protest. But as soon as it becomes illegitimate and it tips over into insecurity, then that is our legal recourse to arrest you, prosecute you, and God knows what happens after that. Iran does not have a particularly high human rights record. So the government is allowing the protesters to protest. They are recognizing that they have a legitimate grievance, but they are cautioning them that if you disrupt things, if you incite violence, then it's no longer a rightful protest, a legitimate protest, and we're just going to squash you. So they have deployed police and troops to university campuses, bazaars, which is, their market or their high street, their main street where the shops are, transportation nodes. Oh, and funerals. Funerals in many parts of the world are very public. The death of imam, the death of a cleric, the death of the patriarch of a family is normally paraded through the street, kind of like you see in movies in New Orleans. And the casket draws a crowd. Those crowds can turn violent. They are a potential hotbed of violence. So that is something that they are squashing. Protests, which can immediately turn into, or funerals, which can turn into rally catalysts. Let's see. What is the U.S. response? Well, the U.S. response is typical. Human rights, respect them. Iranian president bad, and you should probably not go to Iran. We don't actually have an embassy there. I'm not exactly sure if you remember, but we had a little dust up with them at our last embassy, and since then, we have not reopened it. So we have a virtual embassy. They have cautioned Americans not to go to Iran. Shocker, not many people are vacationing in that place. Yeah, so that's what the U.S. response is. UK made a statement to the UN Security Council about the isolation of Tehran and the broader standoff that we have, or they have, with Iran in regards to its nuclear capability. Specifically, and I quote, we call on Iran, what did they say? We call on Iran to lift its restrictions, to urgently lift its restrictions and fully cooperate with the IAEA. They are not allowing the International Atomic Energy folks to go in, look at their centrifuge sites, look at what they claim is a peaceful nuclear power program. And so the UK has used these protests kind of as a backdrop to remind Iran, hey, you need to come back into the international fold. If you do, we can work out some of these restrictions, yada, yada, yada. The EU, the European Union at large, has basically reminded them about their human rights obligations and, again, cautioned about starting up their nuclear program. Kind of the same thing that the UK did, just they packaged it a little different and essentially said there could be more sanctions. So other areas of the global response to this is the Iranians that are displaced outside of the country of Iran, whether it's political refugees, exiles, or people that have immigrated outside of the country looking for a better life. They have all encouraged the protests, but not physically. Obviously, they're not there, but there are a lot of Iranians in exile or Iranians outside are holding their own protests, small, peaceful, and it's risky. This is a risky move because it risks framing the protest as an outside influence. In fact, the state-run media of Iran is actually using that in some of its statements, that these protests are fueled by outside agitators, specifically, the usual group, the U.S. and Israel. You know us, always being agitated. Yes. So outside Iranians holding protests of support and sympathy, but if they do it too vocally, they do it too broadly, then Tehran can, again, claim outside narrative. Okay, so I don't think this protest is going to last more than about 7 days. That's my opinion on this, purely conjecture on my part. But I am basing that on the fact that they are not going to effect change until and unless you have two things happen. The Iranian Republic Guard has to fracture, and you have to have fractures within the political elite. That's the only way that you're ever going to get it. And really and truly, unless the Iranian Republic Guard decides to break, that country is going to be a theocracy in perpetuity. It just is. But it can be exacerbated. The protests can be exacerbated in a couple of ways. If labor joins the strikers, so far it's merchants and it's students. If the oil workers, the transport workers, and the major industrial labor joins, then you have a problem. Because then truly the country grinds to a complete economic paralysis. It can't function without that sector. So if they haven't joined yet, I think they will. I think they will. I think that 40% inflation affects everybody, not just merchants. Look for defections, refusals to carry out orders, visible fractures between the police, IRGC. That could exacerbate things. I think that's the only possibility that this protest lasts. And then the other thing that is a little bit interesting is that the government has not cracked down on social media and internet. It's typically their go-to move. They completely prevent any of these protests from being broadcasts outside the country. They shut down the cell. They throttle the network. In order to have a protest, you have to have communication. And if you can't communicate, and in 2026, communication nodes means social media. If you cannot communicate, you cannot organize a protest. It's as simple as that. If there's any martyrs that come out of this, if there's any popular, charismatic leader of this protest who is killed or captured by the Iranian authorities, that has the possibility to galvanize the fringe, the people that are sort of undecided on this protest. And then you have a pretty big movement. And then if the real continues to slide, I mean, at the heart of the matter is the merchants' frustration with rampant inflation and the high cost of goods and services. So that's ultimately what is going to neuter this protest, is if they can somehow resolve this. And if they don't, it's going to keep going. I think you're going to see targeted crackdowns, arrests. I think you're going to see local concessions to sort of pacify some of the people, and then continue to shut down sectors of industry and infrastructure to disperse people, maintain a curfew, things of that nature. You are also going to see more kinetic response, more backlash from police and military if this doesn't go away. So I guess in another sense, if they don't pacify the protesters through genuine economic results, or through some of these pressure points like dispersing them, then they're just going to crack skulls, quite literally, and force this thing to end. That's my opinion. There's markers that you can look for to see if this protest has the fuel to continue to burn. Like I said, if the laborers can join this protest, I think it has legs, and I think it's going to keep going. The elite fracturing, I talked about that. If you have political elite who break away from the regime, it's a very low probability that something like this would happen, but you don't know. I mean, even those in political elite positions, lots of money, offshore accounts, they're still feeling the pressure of massive runaway inflation. So it's not impossible that it could happen. It's just very, very low probability. And I don't think that any of this is going to indicate that the regime falls tomorrow, but it does create rifts, and that is a potential for competing commands. If somebody sees an opportunity to displace the current regime and supplant it, I don't know. I don't know if something like that has the capability to happen, but it's an interesting psychological line that the protesters have crossed from, protesting about civil liberties or human rights to shouting death to Khomeini. That is a huge psychological line from reform demands to regime rejection. I'm fascinated by it. I would love it if the Iranian people would take their country back. I don't believe in theocracies. I don't believe in radicalization of any religion. And countries like Iran just demonstrate the worst in people and the worst in polluting religion. So the government has a couple of ways that they can respond. I talked about that. I do want to mention briefly that they have complete state-run media. So if you really want to talk about what pure restriction of the press looks like, you need to take a look at Iran. Nothing makes me laugh more than when some college know-it-all hippie decides to call anyone in the U.S. a fascist. You don't have a fucking clue what that word means, dude. You've never experienced true fascism. You don't know what that word looks like, feels like, tastes like. You don't. Go check out Iran. They have complete state-run media for the most part. There's one semi-autonomous, but semi. And make no mistake, if Khomeini doesn't like what's being said, it's going to get squashed. So you have the IRNA. They are official state wire service. So think clean suits, official announcements, administrative rationale. And they can decide most of the images that Iranians see. You also have the IRIB, which is a state broadcaster. They are in charge of essentially mass persuasion and selective visibility. I would say that they are the ones that are most responsible for domestic messaging. External arm, you have Press TV. So this is a English language channel. It's owned by the IRIB, but it's built to counter Western narrative and justify the regime internationally. So kind of think of it like Baghdad Bob, if you remember that from the 2003 invasion, right? That's what Press TV is. External, English language. It's kind of like the North Korean lady. Have you heard that? I love listening to her. There's a North Korean news anchor who's always doing these, shouty, like hilariously loud, vitriolic like frothing at the mouth press statements. I love it. Okay, I digress there. I apologize. Then there's Mizzen. Mizzen is a judiciary media center. They are judiciary linked. They talk about all the prosecutable categories. Wow, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Things that you can be prosecuted for. They basically talk about what's true and what's not. The semi-official one, and I did say that there was one, it's Mehr, M-E-H-R. Do you say that Mehr? I don't know. I don't speak Iranian, and I never claim to. So they're semi-official. They're more state adjacent. They are the institutional amplifier, if you will. Their role is to basically amplify anything that the government is saying, but also to kind of sneak in some human interest stories, some quasi-independent reporting. It is allowed under the regime, but they're closely monitored. Now, there are two others that are pure Iraqi. God, why do I keep saying Iraqi? Iranian Republican Guard Corps. Oof. Sorry about that. I promise I've only had one glass of whiskey. So the messaging that these news outlets are projecting, again, is you have a legitimate grievance, but you cannot do illegitimate street action. And that's the core narrative. The other thing that they're doing is the foreigners did it. I love this one. This one's great. They go to this one each and every time. They're blaming the United States. They're blaming Israel. They're blaming other overseas operations. They are the ones that are responsible. It has nothing to do with us. They've hijacked it completely. Yeah, okay, got it. They're framing the shutdown as weather and energy governance, not protest management, and anybody with 2 cents knows it's a lie, but they repeat it. The Iranian government is talking about severe cold, that there's high energy consumption, and in order to manage that, we're shutting things down. And it may be partially true. It might be. Iran does have a reoccurring winter energy constraints. That is somewhat true. But wow, what a coincidence. Yeah. Okay. I think that's pretty much it. Yep. I think it'll be fascinating to see. I don't think it's going to last over the next week. I don't. Unless it gets legs and continues to, I don't think it's going to last. Yeah. But we're going to look at it. I want to take a look at this next Thursday. We're going to come back to this topic and explore it a little further. I really and genuinely hope that the people of Iran rise up and take their country back. It's well within their capabilities. It's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be bloodless, but it wasn't and hasn't been for any group of people who want their freedom. It wasn't that way for us. It wasn't that way for any group of people that don't want to live under a despot. So, best of luck to you, Iran. I will drink to you, but you are a dry country, you poor, poor bastards. So let's pivot. Let's pivot to my next favorite country, and that's China. So, China. Yeah, so over the Christmas period, they conducted, a goodly portion of December, really, if you come right down to it, but centered really around the end of December, China held military drills around the island of Taiwan. For those of you that have been living under a rock, China really thinks that Taiwan is part of their sovereign territory, much like Hong Kong. And it is not, and it hasn't been. I mean, it depends on how far back in the history books you really want to go, and that is a matter of interpretation. But for many decades, Taiwan has been an independent and autocratic state. It is where the pre-communist government fled to for asylum, and it is where they are to this day. The self-declared legitimate governance of China is supposedly alive and well in Taiwan. So all history lesson aside, China holds a massive military exercise called Justice Mission 2025. Stupid name. The whole point of this military exercise was essentially a dress rehearsal to cordon off the island, to blockade it. So there's basically three ways that China can retake Taiwan. The least military option is a blockade. The most military option is an amphibious landing. China's not going to do an amphibious landing. They're not. They don't have the boats. They don't have the doctrine. They've never done it. They're not trained for it. And the Marine Corps is not going to be willing to train them. And really, Marine Corps is the only one that has that pretty well sewn up. We're kind of the world experts on it. So China can't do an amphibious assault. They know it. There is a middle option. It's kind of a hybrid. We're not going to discuss it. Let's talk about what actually took place. A lot of ships, like a lot of planes. Their rocket force, the PLARC. If you're not aware, all military departments in China are all People's Liberation Army. So there's People's Liberation Army Navy, People's Liberation Army Air Force. You get the idea. I'm just going to say PLA for short. And it's understood that PLA is kind of analogous to saying the Pentagon or Department of War. Cool? All right. They surrounded the island with Coast Guard forces, naval shipping, a couple of maritime ships, lots of planes, and the rocket force. They launched several rockets. Some of these were pretty close to the waterways of Taiwan. I want to say that they came within 25 nautical miles, which when you're talking about a sovereign country, that's basically on your doorstep. They flew a whole bunch of sorties. From what I am reading, some of those sorties are still in flight, and it's a dress rehearsal for a blockade. It's just no two ways about it. And of course, today, President Xi Jinping, Mr. Winnie the Pooh himself, went on television in China and had a New Year's Day announcement, essentially saying that it is inevitable that Taiwan will return to the fold. That is our island. Outsiders keep out. As far as Xi Jinping is concerned, any attempt to interfere with what China is doing is considered as outside aggression, and they're most likely going to see that as an external threat. I think it's laughable because, we have been supporting Taiwan for years, whether you go all the way back to the Carter administration, where there was this tacit agreement that we would support Taiwan, but not officially recognize Taiwan's independence. And it's kind of been that way, but it morphs with each administration a little bit. They hated the fact that Nancy Pelosi went over there, absolutely hated that. And I think that's really when things ramped up. I think that sent a message to China that we were serious about Taiwanese independence, at least autonomy from China. And China took that threat seriously. And I think since then they have been ramping up and looking for ways to retake the island. It also, so Xi Jinping's speech is timed coincidentally right when Lockheed was just approved for a foreign military sale of, I want to say $380 million for a sensor suite that goes on the Taiwanese F-16s. It provides them a tremendous electronic warfare capability, allows them to do ISR in a very high threat counter-electronic environment. It's a great piece of gear. The U.S. flies them on our F-18s and a couple of other platforms. And this sensor suite was just sold, I think 50 of them were just agreed to be sold to Taiwan. And yeah, the Chinese government is very much aware of that. And so I think that at least President Winnie the Pooh's speech was timed in direct proportion to that. So Taiwan's leadership is using the Chinese drills to push a major defense spending ramp up. But that in and of itself is having some issues because internally to Taiwan, there's a group in parliament that is against defense spending, at least ramping it up. They either can't read the writing on the wall or refuse to believe it. I don't know which one. I think it's incredibly myopic. I think that in a couple of years, this is going to matter. And if you don't spend the money right now, right now, it's not going to matter. You're not going to be an independent country. The European Union made statements against what China is doing. Japan, South Korea, the UK, urging China to show restraint, to stop escalating things. So let's talk specifics. So let's talk mechanics. Let's talk about what a blockade can do and why they're doing it. If you ring Taiwan with ships and you control what comes in and what comes out, you basically choke the country. You starve them. It's an island. They have some food. They have some water. They have some things, but predominantly they import. And in order to raise money, they export. Remember, Taiwan, the largest manufacturer of microchips in the world, semiconductors, loads of them. They have to sell them. It means that they have to get packaged onto ships and they have to sail to other countries to consume them. China rings the country, prevents anyone from coming in and going out. It forces a confrontation, not with Taiwan necessarily, but with everyone else. It forces the United States to get involved. It forces our hand. It calls our bluff. They are also looking to see how we are going to react, how our coalition partners are going to react, especially in light of a revised national security strategy that doesn't necessarily care as much about that part of the world that we did a year ago. So they did a couple of unusual things in this blockade. They brought in Coast Guard ships that they don't ordinarily bring in. They launched some missiles that they have never launched before, all of which were designed to not only test China's internal command and control system, but also to see what our reaction would be towards it and what Taiwan's reaction is going to be towards it. The messaging that China is sending is that Taiwan is an internal problem and that outsiders need to stay out. The drills are punitive in nature. They are aimed at deterring separatism. They are insisting that this is purely internal. Xi's year-end rhetoric basically reinforced that, saying that, everyone needs to butt out. The ability for China to test our resolve in exercises like this, it's telling. It tells us that they are walking closer and closer to that line each and every time they do this. The blockade is a lot easier to apply because it's coercion. It leverages civilian logistic ships, their roll-on, roll-off vessels, and it mitigates airlift. It mitigates a whole bunch of other things. It would force the United States and it would force our coalition partners to airlift supplies into Taiwan. In doing so, we would have to cross those Chinese ships in international waters. The likelihood for a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, and an escalation it's massive. It's massive. We would risk a lot in doing so, and China knows that. The blockade rehearsals matters because this is how China could win without landing. They could force political collapse before a full-scale invasion takes place. And it's the obvious move. It's the obvious play. And I think you're going to see more of these military exercises, blockade rehearsals, for lack of a better word. I think you're going to see more of them because they want to, in my opinion, desensitize the United States and its Western allies into what they are doing to the point where it's business as usual, it's status quo. And then all they have to do is wake up one morning and go, oh yeah, well, there was 10 ships, but now there's 200. And oh, by the way, if you fly over our ships, we're going to consider that an act of war. And if you send in any vessels near our ships, we are going to fire upon you because it'll be seen as an act of aggression. They're going to use whatever language they want to use. This is being seen by Taiwan as a pretty egregious increase in escalation, and they are trying to respond in kind. We are continuing foreign military sales to Taiwan. We are continuing to look over war plans, but at some point, the heavy lift is going to have to be done by Taiwan. So domestically and militarily, they're going to have to start ramping it up. The outer ring internationally, at any rate, it's starting to constrict. As I said, the European Union has condemned it. Japan says that the drills raise tensions. Anybody who is geographically impacted was pretty vocal, and then those that are politically impacted, i.e. the UK, the European Union, and the United States, all, they all went on record by saying that this is escalatory. You are going to trigger a shooting war. But the one thing about China is they look at a calendar while we look at our wristwatch. I have said that before. Yeah. The other component to all of this is what we're currently doing in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. I think China wants to continue the conflict in Ukraine. They have funneled economic aid to Russia. They have provided Russia with raw materials to create and fund and fuel its war machine, because the longer the conflict in Ukraine takes place, the more bogged down the United States becomes. And this might seem as a somewhat hypocritical statement by myself, because I have advocated vocally about Ukraine staying in the fight and the United States' increased support of Ukraine staying in the fight. And I don't want to be seen as duplicitous and saying that we shouldn't because it plays into China's hand. No. You can have your cake and eat it too when you are the United States. We're still the biggest kid on the block. China wants to see the United States stretched as thin as possible, and then they can focus their attentions on Taiwan without having the United States pour too many resources into it because we're stretched too thin. That's my opinion anyway, but I think it's a legitimate one. I think there's a case for it. And I now am starting to perhaps think more and more about the revised national security strategy, moving and consolidating towards the western part of the hemisphere, taking those 11 combatant commands and constricting them down to 8. It reduces command and control. It certainly helps our special operators streamline. I think that there's merit there, as long as we don't get lulled into a false sense of security that somehow China does not distract us with the left hand and then do this thing over here in the right. So I do think that it is in China's best interest for us to be involved in Ukraine, to continue to be involved in Africa, in the Middle East, because it allows us to put less and less resources towards China and Taiwan. We have a lot of resources, but in many ways, China has eclipsed us, and they're not leveraging those resources the same way that the United States is. They have not necessarily the same level of technology when it comes to our naval infrastructure that we do, but quantity-wise, they've got way more ships than we do. And they can do, because of those numbers, in many ways more than what we can do. Not necessarily apples to apples, but yeah, they have more. So let's see. China. What else can we talk about on that front? I think that we are going to see over the next 6 to 9 months another iteration of this war game that they just put on. I do. I think that they're going to do another blockade practice, again, to desensitize the United States and the Western world to what's taking place. I think that in concert with that, they are going to continue to publicly say that that is an internal matter. They're going to condemn any time that the United States interferes, comments, and I think they're just going to continue to drag this out until at some point in the next 2 years, it's a legitimate blockade. And then we're forced to react. I don't know at that point what the current administration is going to do, especially in light of the rhetoric that has been taking place over the last 12 months of not getting involved in forever wars, not projecting ourselves into other people's business. But yeah, I think that would be a mistake. I think it would be a mistake not to come to Taiwan's aid, especially with the risk of U.S. strategy and U.S. resources being so heavily tied up in Taiwan in many ways.
The one thing I was going to ask you is pertaining to, well, a couple of things, but pertaining to Iran specifically, with the protests and everything that's going on there and the talk of Israel possibly bombing. Do you see any connection to a ramping up of like Israel or the U.S. in hopes of a regime change?
I don't. I think that's the worst thing that Israel could do at this point. I think that this needs to remain entirely internal. As soon as you present the regime with an existential threat, you shift the focus from what the legitimate concerns of those protesters are to, oh, it's Israel. It's Israel's fault. Do not give them an out. Keep the pressure focused squarely on the regime. If you can keep it there, laser focused, tight messaging, and allow that slow boil to ramp up, you could potentially do it. But any involvement in that country by the United States or Israel, I think that's a horrible idea. Ill-timed. I mean, unless they're, fingers on the button and we get an early warning indicator they're about to launch a ballistic missile into Israel. Okay, that's different. But barring that, leave it alone.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just interesting timing with everything that's going on there because of the talks recently and with Israel and the United States.
Yeah.
Bantering that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that you have to be very careful. First off, the United States doesn't have a great track record when it comes to regime change. So I don't think we really understand the cultural complexities of a lot of the countries that we are involved with and in, and that's fair, right? We do our best, but I think in this instance, I think discretion is the better part of valor. I would prefer to see this one left alone because they're doing a pretty good job of handling it. I mean, the protesters are doing a pretty good job of handling it right now. And I'm really shocked at how much restraint the Iranian government is showing against these protesters. And I don't want that to change.
Why do you think that they're showing so much restraint?
Well, I think that they've learned valuable lessons over the last 10 years in some of these earlier protests and how much negative publicity they received and how they responded to it. I mean, the playbook is typically shut off all media, shut down the internet, beat the living shit out of the protesters until they stop, and then remind them what a great country they're in. They're not doing any of that this time. And I think because they learned that what you're doing every time you do that, although it's effective today, you are building you're building anti-government sentiment for the future. Every person that you beat up, arrest, disenfranchise it's another protester tomorrow. And you also make martyrs out of a lot of people. And I think they know that. And so I think they're going to slow roll this. But they have stated emphatically, if it becomes violent, if you damage property, it's no longer a peaceful protest. It's now a security concern, and we will go in there and shit stomp you.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
Hey, look, I don't know what goes on in Seattle or Portland, okay? I don't know.
I think, the other thing that's interesting about this whole thing is, and which I think is going to be ultimately a facilitator in all of this, because it can naturally cause complete havoc, is the natural resource issues and like water, and we're looking at, like, in this instance, water and electricity and whatnot.
Yeah.
And what that does to a population, how quickly that can turn the tables.
It can, but they don't have a resource constraint in those vectors at the moment. So I don't think that's going to be the issue. It's interesting. God, I overuse that word. Let's find a new word. I think it's fascinating that they're using the economy as a catalyst for protest. Not that has not been throughout history a powerful motivator, but they're not rich, but they're not starving. There's not rampant famine or massive homelessness. I mean, they're not a very rich country, but it's interesting that they are choosing this to rally the flag around. And it's also very unique that it started with the merchant class. That's never been done before.
Yeah, it is pretty fascinating, to use your word.
Yeah.
But I mean, the energy crisis, the water crisis, there's a lot of underlying causes to all of that: the mismanagement, corruption, sanctions, environmental degradation. It is a real deal. And the water situation there is a huge problem. And so that'll be interesting to see. Like, I mean, because the clock is ticking on that. When you have groundwater depletion at the depleted aquifers and all of the things that come with that, you're creating an extremely dire situation.
You are. And I would also sort of double tap your comment by saying they're not real keen on asking for external help either. There's a lot of technology that's not too far from you in the form of Israel, who has massive desalination capabilities. There's opportunities for cooperation there, but not under the current regime. water is going to continue to be one of the world's most precious resources, more valuable than anything else. And Iran's geology is not favorable towards fresh water.
Definitely not.
Nope.
I mean, and then
Nope.
the only other thing I would say, switching back to the China situation is, they've been pressuring in the Pacific now for, some time with their Coast Guard and their military actions and the building of, bases and, creating islands and dumping feces. And I mean, you name it, what they've been doing. And it is, I think, in this instance in particular, you look at how we're spread thin in not only where we're spreading our resources could be like viewed as being spread thin in Ukraine and now Venezuela, where we're kind of ramping up military action there and assets in that region. And so this is a recon mission for them. It's like we can do this and they can gain the information that they need to gain, in that process. And I think that as much of anything as posturing goes is the goal in those situations. It's like we're going to see how the world reacts.
Oh, 100%. And with the exception of, and there's stuff behind the scenes. I'm not saying that the U.S. was completely on the sidelines in this, but they got to see what Taiwan's reaction was. They got to see what the world's reaction was. But in many ways, it was somewhat. It was somewhat a waste because if you really want to see what the United States reaction is going to be, along with its coalition partners, then you need to go all in. I mean, break the 25 nautical mile, break the international, come on in, park your boats 14 miles off the coast of Taiwan, and then you're going to get a reaction. If that's what you really want. I agree with you. It was 100% a fact-finding reconnaissance, especially with the use of the Coast Guard vessels, because that changes the rules of engagement when you have non-military vessels, when you have, merchant vessels, when you have Coast Guard vessels. It changes the rules of engagement and it buys China escalation control. And that was very unique for this particular war game. But I don't know exactly how much information China really gleaned from it. I think it's sort of analogous to, somebody poking their head around the corner, kind of seeing what's out there and like, does anybody see me? Is that and then ducking back inside again. So yeah, in one sense, I think that they probably did, but I really question how much information they truly gleaned. I think good. Yeah. I see this more as a dress rehearsal, and if anything else, I do. Because make no mistake, there were probably no less than a dozen satellites and probably 40 or 50 drones watching every move that the PLA made that entire time. And so I think that there was just as much counterintelligence taking place as there was intel gathering from China.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. China is, I don't see, they have a knack for propaganda. Imagine that.
Yeah.
And I do think that it is as much for the posturing for their own people than it is for anything else. And they have the ability to do that at scale, and they do it often, in a lot of ways. So I don't feel like it's like completely out of the ordinary for China. I think that this has been something that they've been talking about for a long time, and I think that it is more of just a propaganda, scheme at this point. How it, how their confidence is gained over time. What do you think about that? Like, what do you think the end goal is here? Like, ultimately, where do you think this is going to go in the next, 5 to 10 years?
I think it's going to be less than that. I think it's going to be much less than that. I would not be surprised if China pulls the trigger on a full-scale blockade before the administration is out of office. I do. I think that what they are doing more is looking at strategic overload by the United States. I think they see the United States as spread thin. And I don't mean militarily as much as I do strategically. Look, we have a lot of irons in the fire. And I think that between everything that's taking place in the Middle East and Africa and South America, we are sort of, and even we have even said this publicly, vis-a-vis the national security strategy, that we're divesting ourselves of focus on the China Sea and that area, and we're sort of going to focus on the Western Hemisphere. And China's sort of probing to see how much of that is true. And I think once they are satisfied that the temperature is the right temperature to strike, I think they're going to do it. And I think it's going to be before the United States is elects a new administration, before we have a presidential election. That's my thought anyways. And from what I have listened to and read and talked, I think that's pretty universal.
Yeah, it would make sense, I guess, and especially with the volatility of the administration that's in office currently, it would seem to check out that would be the
also,
case.
It would, but also, initially, China, it was egg on their face to have Taiwan even exist. The sheer presence of Taiwan was egregious to their national pride. But the fact that Taiwan has the technological production capacity that they do, when it's us and China in an AI hegemony race, that changes things. That's what's making this so urgent for the PRC. There's no way that China dominates the AI arms race without Taiwan. That's my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. I didn't even think of it that way.
So I think you're looking at, I think you're looking at within the next 2 years. And I don't know what our response is going to be, but the fact that we just sold some of the equipment that we did, the equipment that we gave them is for mitigating China's threat. There's really no other reason for it. They don't have any other natural predator except for the PRC. Sales like that and other things that we have helped enable Taiwan with, yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer. I just don't know what our response is going to be the day that this happens. The morning that this goes down, I don't know what the United States is going to do. Are we going to stand by them, or are we just going to say it's not our fight?
I don't see how you can't stand by them.
I didn't see how we could say that about Ukraine.
Well, we're still in the fight in Ukraine. We're still standing by them. In just the leadership is vacillating.
Yeah, I think that there is a certain segment of the leadership, but there's also a certain segment of society. And I'm not a warmonger. I'm not a hawk. I am not, and I've said this many times before, I am not one of these people that wants to go and pick a fight. But I am also a huge supporter of the underdog, and I don't like bullies. And I grew up when the Cold War was out there, man. people, as I've said before, did duck and cover drills. We did them in elementary school against a nuke threat. And I don't trust Russia. I don't think that the Russian government as a form of government is healthy to freedom, to independence, to the spirit of people. I would like Russia to also take back its own country and have a true democracy, but that's not going to happen, not in my lifetime. All that to say, I think we should support Ukraine in this little country's struggle against their next door neighbor who's a bully, pure and simple. And whether you think it's our problem or not, I mean, we're supposed to be that shining city on the hill. When did we stop? I don't want to go in and invade any country, but you could at least help by proxy some other country who has an aggressor on their doorstep from kicking them off. So all that to say, I don't know how we're going to respond the day that China is blockaded.
I don't see. Yeah. There's a lot at stake in that sense.
There is a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake culturally. There's a lot at stake when you talk about neo-imperialism. China's government has also very recently gone on record and said they're not going to give an inch in South America. Not an inch. They are not leaving that hemisphere. They're not going to withdraw. And they are going to continue to export their culture, their influence, and their infrastructure. And they're not going to give an inch. And I believe it. There was a Panamanian town that tore down a Chinese statue, and the Chinese government was livid, went on record, made a public statement. How dare you? How dare you take away recognition from those Chinese people that helped, create the Panama Canal? I'm like, well, look, man, I wasn't there when the Panama Canal created. I don't know what the demographic makeup was of everybody that helped, but you know what? If this country of Panama doesn't want your statue there, tough shit. It's not racist. It's not xenophobic. They don't want it. And I don't get why that's a problem for China, except for the fact that, to my point, they have gone on record in saying that they are going to fight the United States tooth and nail for presence in that part of the world. And I take them at face value.
Oh, for sure. If you look at their presence, it goes back to your statement that, they've been looking at the calendar and operating off the calendar and not their wristwatch, like that you said earlier, is that, they're in Africa, they're in South America, and they're dug in, and we're definitely behind the fucking game in that sense. And so they have no reason to back down from that. They're so heavily entrenched, when it comes to natural resources. It comes to, the list is a long list.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And basically, because they're looking at the calendar, China is very capable of just waiting us out. And in many ways, they do. Their best play when it comes to Taiwan is not about invasion. It's about coercion. And this is exactly what this blockade demonstration was meant to do. What a lot of this constant day after day after day of rhetoric, the going to the mat, the dying on every single hill when it comes to public statements and propaganda. This is what coercion looks like for the People's Republic of China. This is a textbook methodology. It's cheaper, it's deniable, and it's politically corrosive. It forces the U.S. into constant readiness spending, and it's a strategy.
Exactly. And that's why it kind of felt like there's this like thinness to it, because it didn't feel, for me anyway, watching it, it just felt like a propaganda opportunity and a posturing more than anything else.
No, you're 100% correct. And I think that when this goes down, and it will, It's going to be really final. I don't think it's going to be a long, drawn out back and forth like we've seen in maybe Ukraine, maybe Gaza, maybe other, Somalia. It's going to be decisive. I think it's going to be quick. It's going to be decisive, and I think it's going to be over within a month. And I don't think there's going to be any going back. I think that China could lose, but there's a lot more ways that the rest of the world can. They have to do very, very little to win, I guess is what I'm saying when it comes to a campaign with Taiwan. Okay, so that's it for this week. I did want to mention a couple of things. I have had the pleasure of being a guest on a great number of other podcasts recently, and we will, once those get published, start hyperlinking them in the usual places so that you can enjoy some variety in the content and in the show. Not to mention the fact that we do want to, pay respects to our friends in the business, a lot of other veterans who speak for veterans' health, speak towards some topics of interest to, I think, a great number of you. So I also want to thank our Patreon supporters. If you are interested in becoming a Patreon supporter, you will be given some pretty cool swag, as well as access to some behind-the-scenes podcasts and some content that is only for our premium subscribers. So for the week of January 1, 2026, this is the Iceman. As always, I encourage everybody to enjoy this bright, fresh year and stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.